just, I suppose, the whole idea of assessing water quality is maybe newer again to a lot of advisors here.
Paddy, your sound just went there.
There's a commitment in there to contribute to achievement of environmental and climate objectives at the national and EU level. And I think within ACRES, the cooperation approach, it's a real key means of delivering that objective. And when we're talking about water, the main national EU objectives relating to water really include the EU Water Frameworks Directive and the EU Habitats Directive. So I'll just give you a quick overview as to what is the commitments within those two legislative framework of those two directives. The EU Water Framework Directive, its objective there is to prevent the deterioration of surface water and groundwater. So it's not only about fixing degraded sites, but preventing deterioration of good sites as well. Protect, enhance, and restore all surface water and groundwater bodies. And it's delivered through what's called the River Basin Management Plan, and we're currently on the third plan has just been adopted in 2022. And within that, I suppose there's key objectives are to reduce excessive agricultural nutrient and sediment losses from land to watercourses, preventing in-stream habitat damage from land drainage, to reduce and eliminate point source pollution from farm, eliminate the exceedance of pesticide standards in drinking water supplies, and also an overarching would be protection and restoring valuable and sensitive high status water catchments. So that's the overall thing of the Water Framework Directive. Within the Water Framework Directive, the EPA are the statutory agency associated with assessing ecological status of water bodies, and this is the central kind of thing of the Water Framework Directive. All water bodies, talking about lakes, rivers, streams and groundwater bodies are assigned an ecological status, everything from high down to bad. The illustration here gives you an idea that there's obviously this happy fish inside in the high status water body where you've clean, healthy, resilient, diverse ecosystems, and they're functioning normally. So they're providing all the ecosystem services that healthy water ecosystems should be providing. But then it goes down to good, which is a step below that. Moderate, poor, and bad is obviously severely impacted or severely polluted. There it's the altered system is impaired function and reduces diversity and resilience, and that's where you're losing your ecosystem services, your clean water, your and the other services provided by water or water environment. The map there on the right just shows the distribution of water bodies classed according to these different categories. So you can see there is a good proportion of green water bodies throughout the country, and they're obviously in good status. They're not high. We have very few high status water bodies remaining. These would be the ones where freshwater pearl mussel populations and that are still present, and they're exceptionally high quality. So most of them are down to the level of good or below. So you've got a significant number of moderate water bodies, and then you've got a few poor and bad as well. You can see with obviously the CP areas we're talking about are generally west coast, so things are a little bit better there than on the east, but certainly a very large number of sites require restoration and improvement to bring them back up to good or even high. So that's the status of the water bodies from high down to poor or bad. Associated with that, that's how the EPA also set objectives for each water body. So if it's currently not good, well then the objective would be to achieve its good status again. Or if it was once high in a previous plan and it's dropped down to good or moderate, the objective would be to restore high status in those areas. And then this here is an assessment that the EPA have done as to whether water bodies are at risk of not meeting the objectives in the current plan. So you can see there's a very large amount of water bodies throughout the cooperation project areas and elsewhere in the country that aren't achieving or are at risk of not achieving the directives and our objectives. And not only that, but the trend data also indicates deterioration. So things aren't going good in these catchments or in these rivers. So that's kind of this is all the background as to why we're needing to address the water quality issues. And then there are those that are deemed to be not at risk. Now there's still a proportion of those, but one of the biggest pressures identified in all of this review is agriculture. And so it's such a widespread land use that's not surprising. And then just so that's in relation to the Water Framework Directive. The other legislation in Ireland aimed at improving water quality is the Habitats and Birds Directive, where it's very relevant. There's a large range of aquatic habitats such as lakes, rivers, estuaries, and aquatic species that are considered rare or threatened across Europe. And these you're all probably familiar with special areas of conservation designated for the protection of these habitats and species. And the map here, again, it's showing the cooperation project areas in different colors, and the red outlines are areas of special areas of conservation. And within those, the objective is to restore or maintain favorable conservation status. So it's to improve the condition for these freshwater habitats and freshwater species. And again, there's a lot of conservation objectives and stuff set at all these individual site level. And there's, I suppose the CAP presents an opportunity for us to go somewhere towards trying to achieve those objectives. And similarly with the Water Framework Directive, these habitats and species are severely threatened and there's signs of decline. So I mean, despite all the resources that have been spent in agri-environment up to date, everything seems to still be going in the wrong direction with regards to the conservation status of habitats and species, and that includes all the aquatic habitats and species we're talking about. So I suppose in response to that, the cooperation approach, we're taking a different approach to it rather than the traditional prescription-based approach, where it's hard to measure whether there's any benefit arising or accruing from the implementation of actions and the associated costs. So, as Caroline and previous speakers mentioned, we're taking a results-based approach. It's very much central to the acres cooperation. The results, again, I'm only repeating what Caroline said, that determined using the habitat scorecards on all farmland within the CP zone or all forage land. These results that are given to us through doing the scorecard on a field, that is directly related to the payment issue to the farmer. So then, and through that, the scorecard, it highlights areas for improvement, where improvement can be made. And also another very important thing with the scorecards, I mean, that they're really central to the whole thing, is where and what actions a farmer can take to improve. So it highlights where improvements are needed and how and where those improvements might be done. And it directs of course, it also directs the farmer then to annual financial support through NPIs and landscape actions. So where the farmer is falling down on water quality risks, obviously there's NPIs, landscape actions, that the project team here we can approve subject to putting them in, and that their aim is to improve water quality. Well, then that's another function of the scorecard. It's to highlight where these improvements or actions might be needed. Sorry, now I was meaning to give you a slide on the actual scorecard question. I thought it was in there. Just bear with me 1 second. I'll call it out to you. The question, yeah, the question on the scorecard itself. Sorry about this. It's basically to. I'm just putting it up here for 1 second. It's basically to assess the risk of the risk to natural water courses associated with pressures coming from nutrient sediment or flow or alteration of flow. Can you read it out there, Caroline, if you got it in front of you?
What is the level of risk to the quality of natural water bodies within, adjacent to and downstream of the field due to pressures relating to flow, sediment, nutrients or other pollutants?
That's perfect. And within that, we also, and the means by which that's done is by adopting or referring to a source pathway receptor model. And that's going to be presented in our guidance that we're issuing to yourselves. I suppose the important thing is that that question that Caroline called out is present on every single scorecard that we're using in the cooperation project, and it doesn't differ from one card to another, so it's standardized. So once you understand it for one, you'll understand it for them all. Just when we talk about the source pathway receptor model, it's a well-established way of identifying impacts on the natural environment. So you need all three things for an impact to occur, to arise. You need a source. So in the instance of water quality, we're talking about sediment loss from soil, nutrient loss from fertilizer or soil. We're talking about pesticides or other pollutants that might be arising out of agricultural activity. And then also water quantity due to drainage or alteration of flow. So there's the source. And then it obviously has to be, there has to be a pathway connecting the source to the receptor. The pathway could be drains or overland flow, which is the most common types of pathways in our areas where you've got poorly draining soils and the drains are delivering the source into the receptor. On well-draining land, you've got a vertical pathway where you could have pollutants going to ground, into the groundwater, and maybe reappearing in surface waters at a different location. So that's just something to consider in well-drained lands, the vertical pathway. And then your receptors, obviously you've got streams, rivers, lakes, groundwater, that's kind of straightforward. Those receptors, you can assume in cooperation project areas, we've looked at all of our areas, and basically I think water quality is going to be a target in all of our local areas. Now, some areas it might be higher priorities, such as those high status bodies, but in essence, when you're out looking at a farm, you can assume that a target in this area is maintenance or improvement of water quality. Just to develop a little bit further, to look at the level of risk. So the 4 risks there we've got at the bottom: high, moderate, low, or none. They're the scores assigned on the scorecard. And to get there, we need to look at the source magnitude. So that's whether it's a major source or a minor sourse. You need to look at the pathway type. This is very important, whether it's a direct pathway or an impeded pathway, or there's no identified pathway. So I'll go in a bit more detail about the pathways in a minute. And then you have your receptor type. It's natural water body. It includes modified water courses. And here you've got your rivers, lakes, transitional waters, coastal waters. So that they're your receptor type. And all of our farms will be eventually draining to one of those receptors. So that's why it's important that all fields are scored within these areas and water quality is considered within each of the fields. Just to give you an overview of how we end up at the different risk categories. So high, we consider out that there's a major risk, a major source, and a direct pathway. So there's nothing to impede the pollutant to get to the water course. Minor source and a direct pathway, well, that might be deemed a moderate risk. Major source and impeded pathway, so that's where you've got something that's preventing the source from fully getting through to the receptor. You've still got a moderate risk even in that instance. And then when you've got a minor source and an impeded pathway, it's considered low risk. So, and then you've got no functional pathway, or in fact no source. You've got none. There's no risk identified. So just things to consider. You can see that area photographed there. I think it's important that you get familiar with the farms as you're getting out there and have your maps with you when you're out and about. And obviously what we're looking at here is the blue line, the OP or the OSI blue lines that you'd be familiar with through other schemes. They'd be considered your receptors. So your rivers and your lakes. You can see here the land is always draining towards these. So you want to look at where's the water flow, what is the topography like, and that's going to inform where you need to kind of consider the source pathway intercept or receptor model. So in this image here, you can see the rivers going down through the center of the farm. Those fields surrounding it are orange fields. They're actually peatland fields. So on peatlands, you're talking about soil erosion being the main pressure in these areas, or possibly drainage occurring in them. And you're obviously looking at any connectivity between those expansive areas and the water course. And if there isn't any direct connectivity, if there's no source of impact, well, then you can rule out effects on water quality downstream on account of how that field is managed. So I'd say you want to consider water flow and soil type, and just field observations, direction of slope, presence of sources and pathways, like I mentioned, and then the condition and context of water bodies. Like at those rivers that you're coming across, is there evidence of bank erosion or possibly algae and stuff? That would maybe indicate, well, there's something going on here with nutrients. So it's just you might then need to consider, well, is it coming from this parcel of land or not? It may well not be. Example of sources. So I suppose in the context of CP farm, in a way, it's extensive bare soil could be a major source. Damage where there's livestock or trampling to a riverbank or lake edge, or even a flood zone. So that's where you're getting inundated areas directly impacted. High levels of applied nutrients, pesticides, abundant dung, or presence of other pollutants. Recently inserted new drains can be a major source, and recent modification of a watercourse channel, obviously, if there is interference with a natural watercourse, which should be under regulations anyway, but if that is the case, it could be a major source of impact. Examples of minor sources might be, minor isolated areas of bare soil, isolated minor trampling at the riverbank or lake edge, low levels of applied nutrients and pesticides, and recently maintained or cleared drains. So not necessarily new drains, but cleared existing drains. And the pathway, just to give you a better idea of this, the direct pathway to the water body is where the sources are present along the water body margin itself or in the flood zone. So you've got the other instances where a free-flowing drain between the source and the water body, where there's obvious evidence of overland flow across a steep enough slope. Impeded pathway would be where flows within drains between the source and receptor is impeded, often by vegetation, or it could be a ponded settlement area prior to discharging to the watercourse. So that's what we mean by an impeded pathway. It's not a direct free-flowing drain. There's some impedance along the way that the water settles and gives the nutrients and sediment a chance to settle out of the water. Where there's no obvious evidence of flow paths across the surface, overland flow is impeded by well-vegetated surface and other obstacles or even uneven surfaces. So that again is an impeded pathway where you've got the overland flow is somewhat impeded by the vegetation structure and that. And then you've got no functioning pathway where there's an absence of drains between the source and receptor, and you've maybe a fully intact buffer zone, which is wide enough and considering the slope and other factors that it's providing adequate protection to the watercourse. Sensitive receptor, I mean, I kind of mentioned this, but presence of sensitive water body connected to a pathway, your river streams, transitional coastal. Now, groundwater presents a difficulty in that obviously the pathway there is vertical and it's not very visible. So in those instances where, we know that groundwater is the main receptor and where it's free draining, the scorecard will be somewhat limited and we don't expect you to be able to assess it in any great degree. So we will be, I'd suggest that the local CP teams will be concentrating on water quality issues in relation to groundwaters, and we'll be working with the likes of LawPro and ASAP that are present in these areas to kind of come up with ways of addressing the concerns around that. We have to assume that all free-flowing drains coming off our farms are flowing away and are connected to a sensitive water body, so they do feed into a sensitive water body downstream. Once it leaves the farm, you can assume that's getting into one. Just some examples of assessment examples. The one on the left there, look, it's extensive erosion along a little stream. Animals pure access. You can see the sediment is sitting on the bed of the stream. Any bit of increased flow, well, that's all going to get transported further downstream to the lower or the downstream water courses. So there you've got your major source and a direct pathway. The animals and the erosion is right there in the stream itself. Moderate might be a minor source and a direct pathway. So this is where, there might be a small pinch point where animals are accessing, but it's not giving rise to massive issues and it's not very extensive. So that might be a moderate impact. And again, the next, the one to the right is similar again. You've got a minor source, but again, a direct pathway to a sensitive receptor. Here again, the one on the left there, I think that could probably be up to the high category. It looks like it's effluent coming from maybe a nearby yard or something, and the pathway there is the road. It's leading down into a stream at the end of that gate. So that's just that's something that's quite evident. On the right there, where you've got no buffer zone, maybe between very improved lands and the lake, well, that's getting quite a lot of nutrient input into it, and that's likely to be leading to an impact on that lake there. So again, a buffer zone is something to impede that pathway getting to stop the nutrients getting down into the lake, as it would be important. Flow, recently cleared or created drains, high risk. This is the recently created ones are very big, but they've been over deepened, over widened, they present high risk. And again, it's a direct pathway leading down to a water course. The example of no risk, I suppose, look, water courses in this instance, they aren't accessed by livestock or animals. There's a fence there. There's obviously no spreading of nutrients anywhere close to the river. Therefore, you can assume there's no real risk. Free flowing drain. So this one here is, again, it's a pathway, but even though it's not recently cleaned or created, they're free flowing, so it would still be presented direct pathway. But what's missing from this photo is the source, so there's no real source of potential impact there, so there's nothing to be concerned about despite the presence of a potential pathway. And then we talk about impeded pathways. So this is basically vegetated drains, and that we consider those to be somewhat impeded. The flow of water isn't as direct and quickly discharging into the watercourse downstream. So that's where you assign a lower level of risk on the basis of it's an impeded pathway and not necessarily free flowing into the watercourse. This is an interesting one. I mean, obviously this is obviously a damaging activity, but whether it's impacting water or not, you have to say, well, is it getting down into a watercourse or into a drain that could be really into a watercourse? In this instance, this would not necessarily be scoring low for water quality. Now, certainly elsewhere in the scorecard, it will be impacted on the basis of bare soil, on the basis of other damaging activities on the scorecard will be captured. So this is what Caroline was referring to earlier. It's important not to double hit farmers for the one thing. So in this instance, it wouldn't be captured water quality, but it would certainly be captured somewhere else. And the reason is that it's not mobilized into a downstream watercourse. Here it is. You've got your feeder. This is a common enough scenario. It's near enough to the watercourse. There's soil poaching that in and around the feeder, and maybe even dunging. And that there's a clear pathway from there into the adjacent river, and that's an overland flow. Now, if there was a buffer zone between where the feeding station is and the river, well, then that would probably not be necessarily directly connected. So it would reduce the level of risk significantly. And what's really interesting about a lot of these issues with water quality, they're easily fixed. Like just move the feeder, maybe a bit of fencing and whatever else. And in that instance, it's important to point the farmer towards doing actions or NPIs or landscape actions to improve these kind of situations. And just to go on a bit more about the management advice and actions to improve, I mean, there's point sources like farmyard management, obviously very important, management of tracks, feeders and poaching, appropriate location of drinking troughs, and correct storage of silage bales. I mean, something maybe on some of the coastal sites is the silage bales giving rise to leaching of degraded silage bales and stuff into watercourse or drains. Diffuse source reduction management. This is how you'd. So when we talk about diffuse, it's not necessarily coming from a point source, and this is just about generally management of land drainage, appropriate fertilizer application, to do with soil testing as well, could be informed by that. Management and reduce of herbicide or pesticides, and then I think the important one is maybe just matching the stocking rate to the natural capacity of the land to actually support the number of animals. It's something to consider, particularly in the western catchments. And just to speak very briefly on the non-productive investments, landscape actions, there's a large list of these that we'll be getting more familiar with over the summer and when you'd be putting them in the autumn time, but just to be aware that they're there, and an awful lot of them can deliver improvements in water quality. Now, they're not necessarily sole purpose as water quality, but it's certainly an added benefit of a lot of them, such as fencing can be used, feed storage bills, troughs to get them out as an alternative drinking source, and all that kind of stuff. And then the landscape actions is where they're a bit more involved with the project team. But again, we're talking about impeding pathways by the use of check dams or leaky dams, engineered ditches, and all these different kinds of measures to just impede that pathway from the source into the receptor. Timber weirs is just a few examples. I'll just fly through these photos. I'm pretty much finishing up. An example of something where there's a direct pathway, and to slow that pathway, you can put in weirs. You can see here within about a season or two, as vegetation establishes within the drainage feature, and it slows the movement of water down the river and impedes the flow. I mean, it still doesn't have any significant re-wetting effect on the surrounding lands or anything. That's an important message for it to get across. It still functions as a drain because we've got this V notch within the dam itself. Crossing points. This is, I think, this is also going to be on the MPI and landscape action list, where we've been and again, this is a farm in Mayo where they would have put in these crossing points using a culvert, in this instance, an artificial drain leading to a watercourse. and it just prevents all this cutting up of the land there. Engineered ditch. This is a constructed wetland, but an in-ditch wetland is what we call it. You're expanding the width of the drain. This drain feeds into a watercourse just beyond where Stephen's standing, and it was a direct pathway, and bringing nutrients from that improved grassland into the main river further down. So here we've just set these couple of chambers. The water just distills in those sediment nutrients, and nutrients get taken up by the plants within the wetland once it's established, and just improving the quality and flow of water from the drain into the river. Again, it doesn't have an effect on the drainage of the adjacent field because it's still below the surface. So that's just an example of some of the actions we'd be promoting. Stock management, obviously across extensive areas you can get runoff. Here it's an excellent example of how fencing can improve a situation. And peat flows is something again where these drainage ditches on peatlands can be direct pathways, and here you're improving the habitat and the downstream water quality. So that's it. Sorry if I dragged on, and I can't believe I deleted that slide by accident before I started. But,
No problem.
thanks, Caroline, for coming in.